A family's routine. The morning air was crisp as sunlight streamed through the windows of the Ellison household. James stood in front of his closet, looking at the neatly organized rows of shirts, suits, and ties. His routine was something of an art form, a carefully curated ritual that never seemed to change, but it was the consistency that brought him comfort. He wasn't just preparing for a flight today. He was preparing to set foot in a city that held special meaning for him, a place filled with opportunities and the potential to secure the future for his family. San Francisco wasn't just a destination. It was a stepping stone. "Dad, you're obsessing over that tie again," Marcus called from the doorway, his voice a mix of amusement and mild annoyance. At 17, Marcus had grown accustomed to his father's habits, especially the small quirks that defined him: his meticulous nature, his preference for order, and his reliance on things like lucky ties. But despite his teasing, there was a respect for the traditions James upheld. Marcus, like his father, was driven and focused, but the generational gap sometimes made it hard for him to fully appreciate his father's superstitions. "I have to wear it," James responded, still rifling through his collection of silk ties. "It's more than just a tie. It's a symbol. For 17 years, every important lecture, every major presentation, this blue tie has been with me. I'm not about to break tradition now." Marcus rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress the small smile that tugged at his lips. "Okay, but I think your brain has done more for you than a tie ever could." James laughed, finally finding the tie he was looking for. He held it up for a moment, inspecting its small diamond patterns, each one meticulously woven into the fabric. It wasn't a luxurious tie by any means, but to him it represented something intangible: consistency, success, and perhaps a bit of magic. He gave it one last look, and then tied it with practiced ease. Downstairs, Angela was already in full motion. Her briefcase was packed, her phone was buzzing with work emails, and she was finishing up a quick conference call before they left. She was, as always, the driving force behind the family schedules. Angela had built a career from scratch, rising through the ranks of a top law firm, becoming a partner at an age when most women in her field were still struggling to make their mark. She had mastered the delicate balance between career and family, ensuring that their children had everything they needed without sacrificing her own ambitions. "James, don't take too long," Angela called from the car. She had already started the engine and was looking at her watch. "We've got 40 minutes to get to the airport, and you know how traffic is at this time of day." I'm coming," James replied with a smile, grabbing his briefcase and adjusting his jacket before heading to the door. As he stepped outside, the familiar weight of his briefcase in his hand, he felt the soft warmth of the sun on his face. The Ellisons were a family of planners, always ahead of the curve. Even on vacation, they maintained a level of discipline that others often found intimidating. But it wasn't a burden, it was part of who they were. The drive to the airport was smooth. Angela navigated the traffic with a practiced hand, her eyes darting from the road to her phone, and back again. Marcus, in the back seat, was lost in his phone as well, already texting friends about what he planned to do in San Francisco. Mia, their 14-year-old daughter, had opted to stay behind with her grandmother for the weekend, her eyes glued to her sketchpad as she filled the pages with the bright hues of her imagination. James sat in the passenger seat, content to let his family take the lead while he mentally prepared for the upcoming conference he was scheduled to speak at. The journey to the airport was always a bit of a ritual for him too. Time to think, reflect, and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had always been a planner, a man who anticipated every detail, whether in his career or his personal life. It was this sense of control that kept him grounded, especially when life threw him unexpected challenges. When they arrived at the airport, James immediately noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The chaos of the terminal was familiar, but there was something different about it today. Maybe it was the heightened anticipation of a vacation, or perhaps the increased number of people traveling during the summer months. But to James, it felt like there was a sense of expectation hanging in the air, as though something was about to happen. "Let's go," James said, as they made their way through the bustling crowd toward the check-in counters. Their first-class tickets had already been arranged, so they bypassed the long lines, heading straight for the priority section. James felt the familiar hum of excitement that came with first-class boarding. The spacious seats, the complimentary champagne, the feeling of being pampered. It wasn't just about luxury. It was about comfort and a sense of accomplishment. After years of hard work, the Ellisons had earned this. Marcus, who was always more laid back than his father, looked around at the airport with a mix of curiosity and mild boredom. "Do you think they'll have any cool tech stuff in the airport gift shops?" he asked, his attention drifting away from the task at hand. "Focus, Marcus," Angela replied, not looking up from her phone. "You're about to meet some of the most influential people in Silicon Valley. Don't get distracted by electronics." Marcus muttered a quiet, "I know, Mom," before falling into step beside her. James, meanwhile, was scanning the surroundings, noticing the different groups of people milling about. He could spot the businessmen and women in their tailored suits, the families with small children tugging at their parents' sleeves, the tourists with oversized luggage trying to navigate through the terminal's maze of gates. It was a familiar scene, one he had seen countless times before. And yet, as they approached the gate for Flight 1372 to San Francisco, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was a small shift in the atmosphere, barely noticeable to anyone else, but James had always trusted his instincts. He didn't have long to dwell on it, though, as the gate agent greeted them with a smile. The woman at the counter, perhaps in her late 20s, had short dark hair and wore the crisp uniform of the airline. She looked professional, but there was something in her eyes, something fleeting and unsettling, that caught James' attention. "Good morning," James said with a smile. "We're here for the first-class boarding." The agent looked at them with a smile that was just a little too tight. "Yes, of course," she replied, scanning their boarding passes. But then she hesitated. "There seems to be a slight issue with your seating arrangements. Let me just check something." James raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure everything is fine. We booked first-class tickets months ago." She nodded but didn't look up from the screen. "I'll just verify this. Please wait here." As she typed something into the system, James exchanged a glance with Angela. The tension in the air was palpable now, and James could feel the familiar unease creeping in. Was this just a mistake? Or was there something more to it? He had no answers, only the nagging sense that the small, unspoken discomfort he had noticed earlier was beginning to materialize into something far more significant. The tension unfolds. The seconds seemed to stretch on indefinitely as the gate agent's fingers tapped furiously at her keyboard. The rhythmic sound of the keys in the quiet terminal only heightened the growing tension. James could feel his heartbeat in his throat as he exchanged another glance with Angela, whose normally composed expression had shifted into one of quiet confusion. Marcus stood beside them, tapping away on his phone, as though the entire situation didn't concern him. But even he couldn't ignore the palpable discomfort in the air. There was something off about the way the agent was behaving, something that didn't sit right with the ease of their usual airport routine. James cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. "Is there a problem, ma'am? We've been upgraded to first class." The agent didn't immediately respond, her fingers still typing rapidly. Finally, she looked up, and for the first time, James saw her face clearly. Her smile had faltered, and her eyes were darting between the screen and their boarding passes, a nervous tic he hadn't noticed before. "I'm just verifying something," she said, a little too quickly. "There's a slight issue with the reservation. It appears there's been a mix-up." James tried to stay calm, though his pulse quickened. "A mix-up? We're in first class. We've been booked in that section for months. You can check our tickets. This isn't a mistake." The agent hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, her eyes flickering briefly to the crew of passengers standing behind them. She quickly glanced at her computer screen once more, as if desperately searching for something that would explain the growing unease. "Please, give me a moment," she said, now speaking with a clipped, almost rehearsed tone. Her eyes no longer met theirs as she fumbled with the boarding passes, flipping them over as though they might hold some hidden detail. James' mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't someone prone to assuming the worst, but there was something about the way the agent was acting that felt deeply wrong. It wasn't just a mistake. It was an oversight that seemed deliberate, almost as if someone had decided to create a barrier where there shouldn't have been one. James could feel his patience wearing thin. Angela, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "Excuse me, is there someone else we can speak to? We've been traveling for hours, and we have an important meeting to attend. We'd appreciate your help resolving this as quickly as possible." The agent gave a stiff nod. "Let me call my supervisor." She picked up the phone and dialed a number with the kind of speed that suggested she'd done this before. Her voice, now an octave higher, gave away her unease. "Yes, I need assistance with a first-class seating issue at Gate 12. Please hurry." The conversation was brief, but the urgency in her tone made it clear that something was happening behind the scenes. The gate agent placed the phone down, her shoulders slumping with visible relief, as if she had just passed some invisible threshold. "The supervisor is on their way," she said, her eyes not quite meeting James. "Please bear with me for a moment." James stood frozen, his mind spinning. What exactly was going on? They had traveled this route countless times without incident, always with first-class accommodations. Yet here they were, stuck in an unsettling limbo, their status now in question. A familiar anxiety began to creep up his spine. Angela, who had been scanning the area, noticed that the eyes of the surrounding passengers were now fixated on their small family. People had begun to murmur, some clearly intrigued by the scene unfolding, while others exchanged nervous glances. It was clear to her that something about this encounter wasn't quite as ordinary as it should have been. And then her eyes caught a glimpse of the gate agent's supervisor approaching from the hallway. The supervisor was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face drawn in an expression of practiced indifference. He wore the same airline uniform as the agent, but had an air of authority that made him instantly noticeable. His approach was slow, deliberate, almost too deliberate. And Angela felt an involuntary shiver crawl down her back. As the supervisor neared, the gate agent stepped aside and waved him over, still avoiding eye contact with James and his family. The supervisor exchanged a few quiet words with her before turning toward James, his cold eyes scanning him briefly before shifting to his family. "I understand there's an issue with your reservation," the supervisor asked, his voice smooth but with an underlying edge of impatience. His gaze lingered on James for a moment longer than necessary, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. James' patience was starting to wear thin. He could feel the weight of the supervisor's gaze, but he refused to back down. "Yes, there seems to be a problem with our first-class seats. We've been booked months in advance, and there should be no issue. Could you please check again?" The supervisor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the boarding passes, his brow furrowing as though he were looking for a flaw that wasn't there. "I'll check the system again," he said, finally taking a step back to the counter. As he tapped at the keyboard with slow precision, James felt a wave of frustration rising within him. He had done everything right. He had planned this trip, booked the tickets, and even arranged for special accommodations so they could make it to San Francisco on time. Yet here they were, being held up by a nameless, faceless authority, stuck in the clutches of bureaucracy. What was this really about? Angela, noticing the growing tension in her husband, gently placed a hand on his arm. "James, maybe we should just go with it. Let them sort it out. We'll be fine." But James wasn't convinced. He had seen this before. Unexplained delays, the slow grinding wheels of a system that didn't always have the best interests of its passengers in mind. And he knew, deep down, that the issue wasn't just a technicality. Something else was at play. "Mr. Ellison," the supervisor said, breaking his train of thought, his tone finally shifting into something more formal. "It seems there's been an issue with your ticket. According to the system, you are not eligible for first-class seating on this flight." James blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in narrative. "What do you mean?" "We've been upgraded to first class, and we have the tickets to prove it." The supervisor's eyes didn't meet his. "There's no record of an upgrade in our system. Your reservation is for economy class, and that's all we have on file." Marcus, who had been watching the exchange quietly, now stepped forward. "But we've had first-class tickets for months. My dad's a professor at a major university, and we've booked this trip well in advance. This isn't some last-minute thing." The supervisor's eyes narrowed slightly. "I understand, but as I said, our records show otherwise. I'm afraid you'll have to speak with customer service if you want this corrected." At this point, the tension was unbearable. James could feel the weight of the situation. This was no longer just about a mix-up. There was something deeper, something troubling beneath the surface. Why would an agent suddenly tell him that his family wasn't allowed to board first class? Why had they been singled out? As Marcus opened his mouth to protest, a sudden voice interrupted the growing chaos. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind them, deep and authoritative, and it immediately silenced the conversation. Everyone turned toward the source. The sight of Dr. James Ellison, standing confidently in the middle of the terminal, was about to change everything. What he did next would make this moment unforgettable. The silent storm. The voice that had broken through the tense silence came from behind them, deep and steady. The words, though simple, carried with them an undeniable weight. James Ellison, his hand still gripping his phone, turned slowly to face the new figure that had appeared at the scene. A tall, middle-aged man, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit with a subtle hint of silver in his hair, had emerged from the crowd. His demeanor was calm, but there was something undeniably authoritative about him, something that immediately demanded respect. His eyes swept over the entire scene, taking in the agitated gate agent, the apprehensive supervisor, and the growing circle of onlookers who had stopped whatever they were doing to watch the drama unfold. But what truly stopped James in his tracks was the recognition that flickered across the man's face. It was brief, but undeniable. The man knew who he was. "Dr. Ellison," the man said with a slight nod, stepping forward with measured confidence. "I didn't realize you were flying today." James stood motionless for a split second, his mind racing. The man was someone he hadn't seen in years, but the familiarity was instant. This was no ordinary person, no stranger to the world of academia, business, or influence. This was someone who, like him, had operated in the corridors of power and influence for years. His name was Samuel Bishop, a former colleague and a member of an exclusive academic board that James had worked closely with for over a decade. As the realization hit, James' mind began to race through 1,000 thoughts at once. What was Bishop doing here? What were the chances of running into him at this exact moment? And most importantly, how did he know he was on this flight? Bishop's gaze now shifted toward the gate agent and the supervisor, who were both looking at him with varying degrees of surprise and wariness. The tension in the air seemed to grow more pronounced as the silence deepened. Marcus, still standing beside his father, was now watching the exchange with growing confusion. His father's sudden recognition of the stranger only added to the mystery of what was going on. The supervisor, now clearly rattled by the sudden appearance of someone with such gravitas, quickly straightened up, his face flushed with the unmistakable discomfort of being caught in an awkward situation. "Sir, do you know this family?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of anxiety. Bishop glanced at the supervisor, then back at James. "Yes, I know Dr. Ellison," he said, his tone calm and measured. "And I'm certain that there's been a misunderstanding here. A rather unfortunate one." The gate agent, still fumbling with her keyboard, looked between the two men with wide eyes, clearly unsure of how to proceed. James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The calm, authoritative presence of Bishop seemed to amplify the tension, not lessen it. There was something about the way Bishop spoke that made it clear he wasn't just any fellow passenger. He was someone whose words carried weight, words that could change the course of this interaction. "I believe there's been an error with the reservation," Bishop continued, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Dr. Ellison and his family are in first class. That's not up for debate, and I think you'll find that the situation can be resolved rather quickly with the correct resources." The supervisor, clearly flustered now, opened his mouth as if to protest, but Bishop raised a hand in a gesture that immediately silenced him. "No need for further explanations," Bishop added, his voice unwavering. "Dr. Ellison has already been upgraded, and as I said, I'm sure we can resolve this swiftly." Marcus, now fully engaged in the conversation, turned to his father. "Dad, who's that guy? You look like you know him." James shot his son a brief, reassuring smile, though the situation had grown far more complicated than he had imagined. "I know him from my professional network, Marcus. He's someone who can help make things right." James turned back to Bishop, now seeing the subtle shift in the air, as the situation seemed to be turning in their favor. But the weight of the words "help make things right" wasn't lost on him. There was something unsettling in how easily Bishop had intervened, as if he had expected this moment to unfold, as if he had known precisely when and how to step in. As the supervisor hesitated, still holding the boarding passes in his hand, a faint murmur spread through the waiting passengers. The words "Dr. Ellison," "First Class," and "Samuel Bishop" began to circulate among them, and for a brief moment, the terminal felt like a theater stage, with James and his family at the center of a drama that had far-reaching implications. The quiet whispers of passengers grew louder, more curious, but there was one voice that drowned them all out, the phone in Dr. James Ellison's hand. With a calm but decisive motion, James lifted the phone to his ear, pressing it gently against his face as the supervisor and the gate agent watched in stunned silence. He dialed a number he knew by heart, the personal line to the CEO of the airline. "This is Dr. James Ellison," he said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "I need to speak with you immediately. There's been an issue with my reservation, and I believe it's something that needs your immediate attention. Yes, I'm at Gate 12. It's a matter of some urgency." His words hung in the air, and James could feel the weight of the terminal's attention shift toward him. For the first time since he had walked up to the gate, he realized that the entire terminal was now watching this exchange unfold. Every eye, from the tired business travelers to the anxious families, was fixed on James and the strange, unfolding drama. The tension had become almost palpable, as if the entire terminal had become a vessel for this moment of reckoning. The seconds that followed were heavy with expectation. James stood motionless, holding the phone to his ear as the supervisor and the gate agent exchanged uneasy glances. Neither of them dared to speak as Bishop's presence lingered, adding a layer of gravitas to the already charged atmosphere. And then, as if in response to the mounting pressure, the phone clicked, and the calm, steady voice of the CEO filled James's ear. "Dr. Ellison," the CEO said, his tone immediately recognizable. "What seems to be the issue?" James took a steady breath, the weight of his words suddenly becoming clear. This was no longer about a simple mix-up. This was about a deeper, more insidious problem, a problem that had been festering in the system for far too long. "There's an issue with my first-class reservation," James began, his voice low but full of resolve. "I've been a loyal customer of your airline for years, and I have been upgraded to first class, but the gate agent here is insisting that my family and I don't belong in that section. I believe it's more than just a mistake. It's a matter of discrimination, and I'm asking for your immediate intervention." The terminal seemed to hold its breath, as though the very air had been drawn taut. Bishop's eyes remained fixed on the gate agent and supervisor, his presence still undeniable. The silence stretched on for what felt like eternity, but then the CEO spoke again. "I'll take care of this immediately, Dr. Ellison. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll have someone meet you at the gate within minutes to resolve this matter." James's grip on the phone tightened, and the tension in his chest loosened slightly. "I'll be waiting." Then, as he hung up the phone, he felt the shift in the atmosphere, like a storm cloud breaking apart to reveal blue skies. The tension that had gripped the terminal began to dissipate, and the whispers of the passengers slowly started to fade. They had witnessed something that would leave them talking for days. But for James, the story was far from over. He had made his stand, but the battle for dignity and respect had only just begun. The weight of silence. As James lowered the phone from his ear, a faint tremor of uncertainty crept over him. His eyes met Marcus's, who was now standing close, his brow furrowed with a mixture of confusion and concern. James gave his son a reassuring nod, though inside, he could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. What had just happened? Had he made the right decision to escalate it this far? Was it worth the spotlight now cast upon them? Behind them, the silence in the terminal was still thick, heavy with the unspoken tension that had been woven into every moment. It wasn't just the presence of Samuel Bishop that made it feel suffocating. It was the eyes of every passenger, every employee, all fixed on them. The strange mix of curiosity, judgment, and disbelief from those who had witnessed the entire exchange had begun to feel like an invisible pressure pressing against James's chest. A woman in the crowd, perhaps in her early 40s, stepped forward. She had been sitting in the row of seats nearest the gate, quietly watching the drama unfold. She wore a patterned scarf around her neck, a symbol of understated elegance, but there was an earnestness in her eyes as she approached the small group. "I couldn't help but overhear," the woman said, her voice calm but with an undeniable undercurrent of empathy. "But if there's anything I can do, I don't want to just stand here." James turned to face her, his expression softening. He hadn't expected this. The words of support were rare, especially in such a charged environment. It wasn't common for a stranger to step forward in moments like these, when power dynamics were at their most fragile. But here she was, someone willing to acknowledge the injustice and offer whatever help she could. "I appreciate that," James said, his voice steady. "But I think what's most important now is that we have someone who understands the gravity of this situation." The woman nodded, her eyes flickering to the gate agent and then to Samuel Bishop, who had been silently observing the entire scene. It was clear now that Bishop had recognized the delicacy of the moment. His calm demeanor was an attempt to reassure everyone, but there was a palpable sense of tension in the air, no one quite sure of what would come next. Just then, a tall man in a sharp black suit emerged from the back of the terminal, walking briskly toward the gate. His arrival was met with a subtle change in the energy around them. There was no mistaking the authority in his steps, each stride purposeful, each motion deliberate. The man stopped before the gate agent and the supervisor, his eyes scanning the scene with cold precision. James immediately recognized him, Darren Henson, the head of customer relations for the airline. James had heard of him, and he knew that Henson was no stranger to handling difficult situations. In fact, he had made a name for himself as someone who could quickly extinguish a flame before it grew out of control. Henson turned his sharp gaze toward James, a polite smile barely masking the tension beneath. "Dr. Ellison," he said, his voice deep and formal. "I apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced. I'm Darren Henson, and I've been instructed to personally handle this situation. Please, if you'd accompany me, I'll ensure that everything is rectified immediately." Marcus looked at his father, his eyes wide with curiosity. The subtle unease in his expression was enough to convey that he wasn't entirely sure how to interpret the sudden shift in dynamics. For the first time, James could sense the subtle fear that his son was beginning to feel, not just for what had happened, but for the path ahead. "Dad," Marcus's voice cracked slightly as he stepped closer. "What's going on?" James gave his son a reassuring smile, even though he too was uncertain of what would happen next. "It's going to be fine, Marcus. Everything is going to be fine." But inside, James wasn't so sure. The tension was palpable, and the eyes of the terminal still weighed heavily upon them. He glanced back at the gate agent, whose hand was still trembling slightly on the counter, her eyes fixed downward, as if she couldn't quite bear to look at him. James couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She had only been doing her job, after all. But the way she had handled the situation, both the authority with which she had challenged his family's seating and the utter lack of understanding or empathy, had been troubling, to say the least. Darren Henson led them away from the gate, moving with the efficiency of someone who was used to putting out fires before they spread. As they walked, James felt the murmur of voices rise again in the terminal. The passengers who had been silently observing now resumed their conversations, but the whispers were different this time. Louder, more insistent. A small group of travelers looked toward them with an almost invasive curiosity, their eyes following every step they took. James couldn't help but feel as though every step he took now was being dissected under a magnifying glass. When they reached a private lounge area near the gate, Henson motioned for them to sit. The room was quieter here, less frantic, and James could feel his pulse slow as he sat down across from Henson, his son beside him. The weight of the entire situation was beginning to settle in. "I truly regret this situation, Dr. Ellison," Henson began, his tone now more personal, less rehearsed. "It's completely unacceptable, and I'm taking full responsibility for it. I'll personally ensure that your reservation is honored, and that you and your family have the first-class accommodations you've been promised." James nodded slowly, still processing the words. "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Henson. But I have to ask, how does something like this happen in the first place? How does an airline like yours let something so basic slip through the cracks?" Henson hesitated, his eyes dropping for just a moment before he met James's gaze again. "It's not an excuse, Dr. Ellison, but there are sometimes operational errors, overbooking, miscommunication. But this," he paused, his expression serious, "this isn't just an operational error. It's something more insidious, something that I, as a representative of this airline, need to address head-on." James leaned forward slightly, his attention peaked. "What do you mean by insidious?" "I mean that this wasn't just a mistake," Henson replied, his voice growing firmer. "The way the gate agent behaved, the way she questioned your reservation, the way she disregarded your family. There was more going on here than a simple mix-up. There's a culture within certain corners of our staff that I'm not proud of, and I intend to make sure this gets addressed." The words hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. James felt a ripple of discomfort. This wasn't just about an isolated incident. It was about something much deeper, a systemic issue that had now come to light in the most public and damaging of ways. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Henson," James said after a moment, his voice steady but firm. "But let's be clear. This isn't about one bad agent. It's about the larger culture at play here. And that's something that needs to change, immediately." Henson nodded, his expression tight. "I agree, and I'm committed to making sure that change happens. I'll ensure that the proper steps are taken, starting with a thorough review of how your case was handled and continuing with training for all of our staff." The quiet hum of the terminal seemed distant now, as though it belonged to another world. For the first time in what felt like hours, James allowed himself to exhale. This battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like it might be one worth fighting. He could sense the shift in the air, a change that had been set in motion by a simple phone call, but one that would have a lasting impact. He glanced at Marcus, who was now looking more relaxed, though his curiosity was still palpable. The journey ahead was uncertain, but at least they were no longer standing alone. They were no longer just victims of an unfair system. They were part of something much larger than just themselves, part of a movement for accountability and change. And in that quiet moment, James felt a quiet, steady resolve settle within him. The battle wasn't over, but it had only just begun. The unseen struggles. As the moments passed, The tension in the private lounge seemed to dissolve into an almost surreal calm. Darren Henson, now fully in control of the situation, had ordered the necessary changes to the reservation, ensuring that James and his family would be seated in first class as originally intended. Yet, as the minutes stretched into hours, James found that his mind wandered to deeper places, beyond the immediate drama of the gate. Though the confrontation at the gate had been resolved in a manner that felt at least superficially satisfactory, James knew that it was more than just a single episode of inconvenience. This moment was a stark reminder of a larger reality, one that had been simmering in the background of his daily life, but was seldom spoken of. He had been a witness to the ugliness of discrimination before, but this particular instance brought it into sharp focus, almost as if it had unfolded before him in slow motion. Marcus, still seated next to him, was thumbing through his phone, but the air between them was heavy with 1,000 unspoken words. James knew his son well enough to understand the quiet questions swirling in his mind. Though Marcus was young and intelligent, with a future brimming with potential, the world had a way of placing insurmountable obstacles before black men, obstacles that often had nothing to do with their abilities or worth. The quiet hum of the lounge's air conditioning was the only sound that seemed to break the silence between them. James cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, trying to break the stillness that had taken over. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at his son. Marcus didn't look up from his phone at first, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "Yeah, just." He paused, his words unsure. "I don't get it, Dad. Why do people do stuff like that? Why does it even matter if we're in first class or not?" James leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath, as he tried to find the right words to explain something so much more complicated than a simple conversation could encompass. He had spent his life navigating these kinds of moments, but they always caught him off guard, always felt as fresh as the first time. "It's not just about first class, Marcus," he said slowly, his voice laced with experience. "It's about the way people view us, how they judge us before they even know us. For some people, our blackness is a barrier. It's a reason to treat us differently, to hold us back. And sometimes, it's not even something they're conscious of. It's just the way they've been conditioned to see us." Marcus's gaze finally lifted from his phone, his eyes locking with his father's. For the first time, James could see the subtle dawning of understanding in his son's eyes. The same look he'd had when he first learned of the injustices his ancestors had faced. It was a mixture of confusion, anger, and sadness. A child coming to grips with a reality that no one should have to face. "I don't get it," Marcus said again, his voice quieter now. "How is it that we can be doing everything right, working hard, being good people, and still get treated like this?" James felt a pang in his chest. His son was smart, ambitious, and compassionate. He had spent his whole life helping Marcus navigate the complexities of being a black young man in America, preparing him for the subtle and not-so-subtle biases that he would encounter. But no matter how much he tried to prepare his son, there were still moments like these, moments that would chip away at Marcus's sense of fairness, moments that would leave him questioning the world around him. "I don't have all the answers, son," James replied softly. "I wish I did. But what I can tell you is this: it's not your fault. It's not your mom's fault. It's not mine. It's the world we live in, and we can't control everything. But we can make sure that the way we respond, how we stand up, how we fight back, that's up to us. And in moments like this, we're showing everyone that we won't be silenced." Marcus nodded, though the question still lingered in his eyes. There was a quiet sadness in the way he held himself now, a heaviness James knew all too well. Just as the conversation seemed to stall, the door to the lounge opened, and the same gate agent who had caused the earlier disruption entered. She hesitated in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face was still pale, but there was something different about her now, less sure, less defensive. "Dr. Ellison," she said, her voice almost trembling. I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you and your family earlier. I realize now that I was wrong, and I should have handled the situation differently. I'm deeply sorry for any distress I caused." James studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. The apology, though offered, didn't feel as sincere as he had hoped. There was something about it that rang hollow. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them. As if she had been forced to say them, as if it were a scripted apology rather than one born from genuine regret. He took a slow breath, then nodded once, his gaze steady. "Thank you for your apology," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about a single apology. It's about understanding the systemic issues that led to this moment. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The gate agent looked down at the floor, her fingers trembling. "I know. I realize that now. And I'm going to work to make sure it doesn't happen again. I won't forget this." James didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure if her words were meant to reassure him, or if she was just trying to smooth over the awkwardness of the situation. Either way, he knew that this was just one piece of the larger puzzle. As she left the room, James sat back again, his mind racing. The apology, the efforts to make it right, they were all good steps, but they didn't address the larger question. What happens after this moment fades from public view? What happens when the spotlight shifts, when the cameras turn away, when everyone forgets? This wasn't just about what happened at the gate. It was about what had been happening for years, for decades, for centuries. The systems of power and privilege that had allowed such injustices to persist needed to be dismantled, and that required more than a few apologies and a temporary change in seating arrangements. It required a movement. It required action. It required a collective will to change. James knew this. He had always known it. And yet, moments like this, moments when he stood at the precipice of something larger than himself, reminded him of how far they still had to go. He glanced over at Marcus, whose gaze was fixed out the window, his thoughts clearly still lingering on the injustice they had just faced. "Are you ready to go?" James asked softly, his voice steady, resolute. Marcus didn't immediately answer, but after a few moments, he nodded, his expression hardening with quiet determination. "Yeah, let's go." And with that, father and son stood together, leaving the lounge behind. The terminal was no longer silent, but the weight of their journey lingered. The story was far from over.